Dear students, welcome to your second course in literary genres, which is entitled Dark Romanticism and the Textual Analysis of Morella. And this is part 1. In this lecture, we are going to identify the aspects of dark romanticism in one of the most fascinating short stories by Edgar Allan Poe. It takes the Gothic horror genre to its peak. The short story Morella was first published in April 1835 in the Southern Literary Messenger. Apparently, it explores the strange nature of relationships between a husband and his wife, but deeply it addresses the questions of human existence and the nature of death by locating them in a more philosophical discourse. The short story relies on moral theology in order to answer this question: are we immortal? Is human soul immortal? The answer, according to the prominent German philosophers Johann Fichte and Friedrich Schelling, is yes. And the key is in the philosophical concept pantheism, which means the belief that the universe is a part of God and God is a part of the universe. The short story also evokes something about Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy by showing how humanity can transcend mortality through its will to power and knowledge. Moral theology, or theological morality, is a branch of religious and philosophical thought that examines questions about morality and sanity. It is captivated by this great question: what does it mean to be a good and sane person? Although Poe relied on this field to address the question of death in Morella, his life had a different story. His nervousness and sensitive reaction to the illness of his wife, Virginia, defied the boundaries between sanity and insanity. In order to capture the state of being in between, he responded in a letter to a friend of his to answer why is he suffering from what he called a terrible evil. He emphasized this state of in-betweenness by saying, "I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity." In the letter, at the end of the passage, Poe constituted an aesthetic effect by playing with concepts and words, and he stated that his wife's death was a permanent cure to his insanity. Edgar Allan Poe is an American famous short story writer, a poet, a critic, and an editor. He is famous for being a champion of mystery and the macabre. Nicola Benin states in an article that Poe is regarded in literary histories and handbooks as the architect of the modern short story. Also, he is considered as the principal forerunner of the art for art's sake movement in the 19th century European literature. Edgar Allan Poe was born to professional actors in the 19th of January 1809 in Boston. His parents died when he was 3 years old, and he was adopted by John Allan, and that's how he had his middle name, Allan. His life marked by a series of tragedies and failure, including the fact that he was a dropout from the University of Virginia in 1827 for financial problems. Then he joined and discharged from the army in 1829, and he was editor in the 1830s and 1840s for different journals. He also suffered the death of his wife Virginia in 1847. He died on the 3rd of October 1949 in Baltimore, Maryland. As I have said, Edgar Allan Poe is famous for being a champion of mystery and the macabre, and even his death is tainted by mystery. Even today, the reason behind his death is still not known. Over the 2 decades of the 1830s and the 1840s, he gained a great experience as an editor and literary critic. He even formed an aesthetic theory based on the idea of unity. The legacy of Edgar Allan Poe is gigantic. He wrote many different short stories and poems, and he invented different techniques and devices that are used in the Gothic horror genre and the mystery and even the detective genre. His short stories evoke fear and curiosity and provoke the reader in the sense that it introduces him or her to the unusual and the grotesque. I have selected here 4 works, 3 short stories and 1 poem, which I consider as the major literary works written by Edgar Allan Poe. The first short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, is famous for it contains the features of the Gothic genre. It was published in 1839 in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. Then it was included in the collection Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, which was published in 1840. And this short story, it was even adapted to a movie in different years. For instance, we may refer to the adaptation of 1960, or the recent adaptation which was done in 2008. The house of the protagonist, Roderick Usher, is depicted as a house which is haunted by the presence of evil spirits, and this creates the atmosphere which is dreary and gloomy. And even the protagonist is depicted as physically and emotionally ill as his own house. The short story contains different Gothic features, for instance, the haunted house, the dreary landscape and the gloomy weather, the morbidity of the sister or the twin sister of Roderick Usher, which she is possessed by a mysterious sickness, and there are other different features. Another great short story that was written by Edgar Allan Poe is The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which was published in 1841 in Graham's magazine. It is well known for it has been described as the first modern detective story. Even Edgar Allan Poe called it as one of his best tales of ratiocination, which means it involves or its plot involves the process of reasoning and thinking in order to find out the truth behind the mystery of committing a murder. The protagonist of the short story, C. Auguste Dupin, is described as a prototype of a genius detective who observes and recalls insignificant details in order to reach surprising conclusions. So this short story introduced the devices of the modern detective story in the sense that it depicted the criminal detection trope using the power of the analytical mind in order to resolve or to come up with solution for a complex murders and mysteries. Another great short story which was written by Edgar Allan Poe is The Gold Bug. It was originally published in 1843 in Philadelphia Dollar newspaper, and it is considered famous for it includes aspects of adventure, mystery, and it consists of symbolic features. These short stories, among others, reveal the technique of Poe, which he called a unity of effect. This means that each aspect of the story should contribute to its general tone. In addition, Edgar Allan Poe employed viewpoints of a reliable first person narrator that affected the reception of his stories and located the reader in a state of wondering, confusion, disbelief, and doubt. If ever there is a work which made his or her writer famous, it must be The Raven. It is a narrative poem that made Edgar Allan Poe very famous. It was first published in 1845. It is filled with musicality, stylized language, and dreary atmosphere. It tells the story of a talking raven who visited a disillusioned lover who is traumatized by the loss of his beloved Lenore. The poem has a melancholic tone. It is full of fear, loneliness, and uncertainty, and it evokes the themes of death and the burden of memory that the narrator tried to escape but he couldn't. Also, the raven is considered as a symbol of the subconscious and irrationality. Gothic fiction or Gothic literature was named after the Gothic architectural style which was popular during the medieval era. Even the first use of the term in literature was appropriated by the English writer Horace Walpole for the sake of describing his story as barbarous and deriving from the Middle Ages. According to Patrick Kennedy, the term means that the story happened to belong to ancient times than it has recently discovered. Gothic literature is a genre that emerged as one of the greatest types of dark romanticism in the 18th century. It is characterized by the defining elements that paralleled the aspects of the Middle Ages, in the sense that it incorporated similar themes and settings. It, for example, or in Gothic fiction, we can find the use of picturesque scenery and melodramatic devices that create the atmosphere of mystery, horror, and terror, and even evoke the feelings of fear and suspense. For example, we can find locations that are terrifying. For example, dark forests, old castles and mansions, and graveyards are even common in Gothic fiction. We can even notice or observe the characterization in Gothic fiction is meant to depict terrifying messages, such as, for example, the supernatural presence, the burials of the dead, mysterious sicknesses, and even coming up with techniques that create this emotion or feeling of fear, like, for example, the technique of flickering candles, and for example, the presence of devices and signs that dictate tragic endings, such as omens, curses, and visions, which foretell or come up with a prophecy that would dictate the tragic endings of the protagonist. Well, according to Patrick Kennedy, no writer could master this great genre like our great writer Edgar Allan Poe. And we are going to see this in his short story Morella.